Welcome, everybody. My name is Mark Mather. I'm Associate Vice President of U.S. Programs with the Population Reference Bureau. I want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the economic and social consequences of job loss and unemployment. I have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. First of all, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit to the presenters, there should be a question box on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. So I encourage you to type any questions that you have into that box, and the panelists will answer questions at the end of the presentation. There's also going to be a very brief survey at the end of this webinar, so we encourage you to take the time to fill that out because it helps us plan for future webinars. This webinar will be recorded, so if you do need to leave early, you should be able to access this online. And you should be receiving an email within 24 hours with a link to the recorded version of this presentation. So at this point, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. We have Jenny Brand, who's Associate Professor of Sociology and Associate Director of the California Center for Population Research at UCLA, and Till van Wachter, who's Associate Professor of Economics and a faculty affiliate of the CCPR at UCLA. They're going to talk about some of the short and long-term consequences of job loss and unemployment for families in the United States. They're going to speak for about 20 minutes each, and their discussion will be followed by 10 or 15 minutes of questions and answers. This webinar is provided by PRB Center for Public Information on Population Research with funding from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute for Child Health and Human Development. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers.
Hi, Mark. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start, and I'm going to first, so the whole webinar is divided into 4 parts. I'm going to first start talking about the effects of job loss on earnings and career outcomes, and the effect of job loss on health. And then Jenny's going to speak about the effect of job loss on social participation and child outcomes. Now, just to start, job loss and unemployment is a very frequent event in the U.S. economy. So this figure shows you various measures of the incidence of job loss and unemployment in the U.S. economy starting in 1990. And what you see is, well, in every given point of time, there's a high rate of job destruction and layoffs. And it's important to know that not all of these layoffs and unemployment flows are necessarily costly. Many workers find immediately jobs that are similar, or many unemployment spells are very short. Now, what we'll be talking about today is that some of these job losses are indeed very costly. And those job losses that are costly tend to be concentrated in recessions. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude, in the 2008 recession, the Displaced Worker Survey, which is a survey run by the U.S. government, suggests that between 7 and 15 million of individuals lost their job. Now, measuring who is laid off and why is quite tricky, right? So that's why I'm giving you a range, but it's clear that the number is very high. If you go back in time, the last big recession before the 2008 recession was the 1982 recession. And in the course of the 1982 recession, about 20% of workers who had a stable job at a good firm lost their jobs. So these are very large numbers. So the point of the slide is that, well, even though job loss is frequent and not all job loss may be costly, there is a very large number of people who may be affected by very costly job loss. Now, much of what we're going to talk about is how to measure the cost of job displacement for workers and then for families. And what we're going to be talking about is mainly the event of a layoff in which a worker loses the job to no fault of one's own, but due to economic conditions at their firm. And the typical approach to measure the effect of such a involuntary job loss is to compare workers who lost their job to similar workers who did not lose their job. And although this treatment control approach in some way is conceptually straightforward, it's often very hard to implement. And the reason is, of course, that job losers may differ in observed and unobserved characteristics from those workers who don't lose their job. For example, firms may have an incentive to displace those workers, to fire those workers who are have less valuable skills or are less motivated, or who may be of lower health, for example. So there are many potential reasons why the potential outcomes of job losers may differ from the potential outcomes of those who didn't lose their job, but who we would like to have as a control group. And so by and large, today we're going to take two approaches to deal with this problem of potential differences between job losers and the control group of non-job losers. And one is we're going to use information from workers' employers to isolate employers that had a sudden mass layoff or a plant closing. And the idea is, well, there we know for sure that it's much more likely that the worker leaving a firm that had a mass layoff or a plant closing actually left because of economic conditions. And another approach that we'll take is to make sure that the job loser and the non-job losers whom we will compare them to are very similar in terms of career outcomes prior to the job loss. So by making sure that workers look and evolve alike before the job loss, we can help persuade us that the comparison we're making is actually a valid comparison. And so that the bottom line is that if you do these comparisons carefully, you get very robust and, as it turns out, very large estimates of the effect of job displacement. I'm going to start talking about one particular study we did based on Social Security earnings data. And in this study, we followed workers who lost their job and at any point in time from the early 1980s to 2005 for as much as we could in the data up to 20 years. And the way we define job loss in these studies, these are workers who had at least 3 years of job tenure at their job and who lost their job at an employer who was of medium to large size. So the employer had at least 50 workers, and where the employer had a mass layoff or a plant closing. And then we compared that job loser to similar workers who did not lose their job during the same period of time. And the main result of that study, which is based on Social Security earnings data on both workers and firms, is in the figure you can see here. And this figure has two lines, but I'd like you to concentrate first on the lower line, which is the blue line. And what the figure shows you is the difference in earnings of job losers relative to a baseline, which is 8 years or before job loss, and relative to the regular evolution of earnings for people who did not lose their job. And then, so the horizontal line shows you the years before and after the job loss, which occurs at time 0. And the vertical line shows you the percent earnings loss relative to the average baseline earnings of workers. And if you look at that figure, you should get at least 3 messages. The first message is, well, before time 0, before the year of job loss, the earnings of job losers and non-job losers, by and large, evolve similarly. So they're close to 0. So that's good. So that gives us confidence that at least before the job loss, these two groups that we're comparing are quite similar. And then the second thing you see is that around the time of job loss, there's a very steep reduction in earnings, and it's very sudden. And in the year after a job loss, year 1, the average earnings loss is about 40%. So these are very large costs of job loss. And the third point of the figure is that there is some recovery. So in the first 10 years after job loss, earnings recover somewhat. And that is good news, but even so then the recovery stops, and then even 15 to 20 years after job loss, earnings losses are about 15 to 20% relative to the initial wage. So the main message of the figure in some sense is, well, the blue line is well below the horizontal line at 0, or even 20 years after you lost your job, meaning that your earnings is much lower than the earnings of the control group that did not lose a job. And if one adds up the implied effect on lifetime earnings, these numbers imply that a worker who lost their job, their stable job at a good firm, during a recession, had a 20% loss in lifetime earnings. That's a very large number. Now, the other line, which is the line for job loss due to expansions, shows that, well, job losses happening in better economic times have lower initial earnings losses and lower long-term losses. But the effect doesn't go back to zero. So there is still a loss 10 to 20 years after losing your job for workers who lost their job in good economic times. Now, an important thing to keep in mind looking at this figure, that this treatment control comparison that analyzes the figure leads estimates of the effect of job loss that are extremely robust to other controls for potentially selective job displacement. So we are very confident that we actually estimated the causal effect of job loss for these workers. Now, even if one takes these large and lasting losses at face value, a common question is, well, do these losses, or such large losses, only occur for certain groups in the labor market? So the typical question is, well, are these losses mainly driven by men who had been at their job for a very long time and may be losing job in durable goods manufacturing? So these are very high-paying jobs. And the answer is no. And this is what the following chart shows. What the chart shows the earnings loss 15 years after job displacement for different groups in the labor market. And these are earnings losses for workers who lost their job in the 1982 recession. And what you see here is essentially two things. First, you see that there is, as expected, variation in the cost of job loss. So for example, if you look at the age of displacement, workers who lose their job at age 50 to 55 have much larger earnings losses than workers that lose their job at age 30 to 40. Now, the second message is that almost every group in the labor market has substantial and long-lasting losses. For example, even workers who are displaced in their 20s have very long-lasting effects. The effects are large for both men and women. The effects are large for the entire range of the wage distribution, and they're also large across most industries. And the only exception is construction, which is an industry that has typically, a large amount of seasonal layoffs. So it's perhaps not surprising that construction workers experience less of an effect. Now, overall, these findings suggest that job loss can lead to very substantial and very long-lasting reductions in annual earnings for large groups of workers in the labor market. It is important to note, though, that earnings is not the only outcome that's affected. That's important because it could, of course, be that workers accept wages that are more desirable along other dimensions and accept lower earnings. And it turns out that that's not true. So, for example, using Social Security data, we have shown that a job loss leads to an increase in earnings instability. It leads to repeated layoffs, an increase in job mobility across industries and regions. And all of these things, so the increased job mobility and across industries, regions, and jobs, means that workers have a difficult time reaccumulating sort of job-specific or industry-specific skills. We also find that job losers typically take jobs at firms that are smaller and pay lower average wages. So by and large, it looks like workers move to less attractive employers and have sort of more unstable careers. Now, in a recent study, Jenny showed that job losers also take jobs that have lower occupational status and lower benefits. And that's very important to know, because using the administrative data, we know something about the firms and about sort of career dynamics, but we don't actually know which specific jobs people take. And here Jenny uses survey data with explicit information on the particular job an individual has taken up. And so we know that not only do workers take jobs as less attractive employers, but also they take less attractive jobs that have lower occupational status and lower benefits. And the only real silver lining in that overall literature is that, at least in the past, job losses only meant a temporary loss in health insurance. If you had health insurance and lost a job, eventually you would get bad health insurance, but it would take 1.5 to 2 years. So given these very large losses in all other characteristics, I guess that counts as a silver lining. And so the bottom line is that there's no evidence really that workers take lower paying jobs in favor of some other desirable quality. In fact, jobs are less attractive, these workers' takes are less attractive among all dimensions that we can measure. Now, given that there are such large and substantial effects of job loss on earnings, it is likely that other aspects of workers' lives are affected as well. And this has led to an increase in literature that studies the effect of job loss on other outcomes, and most commonly health. And the study of health really is interesting for several reasons. Now, clearly, if workers are experiencing such a stressful event, that this event may have consequences that go beyond earnings. So, for example, it's likely to affect stress and health outcomes that are related to stress. And one has to be a bit careful because the reduction in earnings itself will also trigger a decline in health. If people have less to spend on consumption or on health goods. So one has to be careful not to double count the effect of job loss when one considers both earnings and health. But there are many health outcomes that probably don't directly run through earnings that one should definitely study. But another reason why health is very interesting is that health can become a direct measure of workers' well-being after a job loss. And the reason is that it is actually difficult to find out to what extent the large reduction in earnings that I just showed you really also lead to a decrease in the reduction of resources at the family level. So in other words, we know that earnings decline substantially, but it's much harder to measure what happens to family income and family consumption. So to the hard-boiled skeptic, right, these large earnings losses don't necessarily mean that workers are worse off because, well, they say it may be that spouses enter the labor market and increase their earnings and the family might be doing quite well if one, in addition, takes programs such as unemployment insurance or other government transfers into account. And so looking at an outcome measure such as health allows us to say, well, are workers really worse off? And it turns out the answer is yes, not surprisingly perhaps. Now, as for earnings, there are two typical sources of health outcomes. The first one is administrative data, and that is typically data on mortality. And the advantage of using administrative data is that one has that data for very large populations and for a very long period of time. However, of course, mortality is a pretty extreme outcome and misses potentially less stark health outcomes. And so another source of important data is self-reported survey data on health. And that has much more detailed outcomes in health, but is available for somewhat shorter period and smaller samples. I'm going to summarize the result of a study we did on Pennsylvania job losers that gives you sort of a sense of what could happen for very costly job losses. So the advantage of Pennsylvania is that Pennsylvania in the early 1980s experienced a very large amount of layoffs. And that has two advantages. Now, first, there are a lot of job losers we can look at, and they experience substantial earnings losses. The second advantage is that, well, they occur early enough that we can follow workers for a long period of time, but in a period where there was already very good data collection mechanisms in place. So we were able to have information on workers' firms, workers' earnings for a long period of time before and after job loss, plus information on mortality for over 25 years. Now, the strategy that we're going to be using to evaluate the effect of job loss on mortality is going to be quite similar as the strategy for earnings, in the sense that we'll take a group of workers who is losing their stable job at a mid-sized to large firm while that firm has a big mass layoff or a plant closing, And we're going to compare the mortality rates of those workers relative to similar workers who did not lose their job at a firm. Now, the difference with respect to the earnings analysis, of course, that people have to be alive when they lose their job, and so we can't use pre-displacement outcomes to look at the effect of, or to check whether our treatment and control groups really are similar to each other. And so what we will do, we will look at workers who have a similar earnings levels and similar earnings trends and similar firm size or firm average wages prior to job loss. So we try to make sure that we're not comparing apples to oranges, but we don't have health outcomes prior to the job loss. And so to really make sure that these mortality effects that we'll find are not because, say, less healthy workers lose their job. We provide sort of an additional step in the sensitivity analysis where we compare the effect of mass layoffs on mortality directly at the firm level. So we look at every worker at the firm while the firm is having a mass layoff, and we compare the mortality rates at the firm level before and after the mass layoff. And so we can really look at the change in the mortality rate at the firm level. And that comparison is not affected by the selection problem, at least not on the worker level. And it turns out that the estimates that I'm about to show you are very robust to this additional sensitivity check. Now here's the main figure from that study. And what you see here is the difference in mortality rates of job losers relative to the mortality rate of non-job losers, holding these are observable characteristics prior to the job loss constant. And you see that again, the horizontal scale are the years since job loss. And the vertical axis shows you the proportional increase in mortality rates. And note, this is the same figure as you saw for earnings, only that there is no pre-period for reasons I just explained, because people have to be alive until job loss. And the figure has essentially two main messages. The first message is that there is a large increase in mortality rate right after job displacement. So this is when most workers are relatively young. So yes, we see an increase in mortality rate, so close to 100%, right? But this is off of a very low base in mortality. So there's a short-term, relatively large proportional increase in mortality. Then the effect of mortality dies down over time, but it doesn't quite go to zero. And in fact, even sort of 20 years after the job displacement, these effects are quite precisely estimated, and they're positive, and they're actually quite substantial. And if one adds up what this sort of increasing lifetime profile of mortality means, it implies that for workers who loses his job in a recession in middle age, he could see a decline in life expectancy by 1 to 2 years. And these are quite substantial numbers. Now, we don't have cause of death in this particular study, but from other research, we know that the short-term effect seems to be driven by what people call external causes of death, such as accidents or suicides. And there's good reason to believe that the longer-term effect is driven by more chronic health conditions. Now, the mortality is, of course, a pretty extreme event. And it turns out that job loss has negative health consequences well before death. And this slide summarizes just a few studies. And for example, one study has found that, again, using survey data and self-reported health, is that job loss can lead to, raises the incidence of heart attack or stroke. And another recent study by Jenny found that job loss leads to a rise in depressive symptoms, which is very important to know, and it's also found in similar data in other countries in Europe. where there's no health effects, no effect in physical health, but in many places there's effect on mental health. And interestingly, Jenny's work also showed that if one does have health information prior to the job losses, that there are some job losses that are driven by declining health, and if one takes out the job losers that actually lose a job because of declining health, that there's, for example, no effect on self-reported health. And so I think that that's important when one thinks about the potential for selection in these studies. Now, that said, I think overall, job losses seem to really lead to a decline in health outcomes in the short run, and a rise in mortality in the short run, but also a very persistent rise in mortality. And in our Pennsylvania study, we looked at what could be triggering this persistent rise in mortality. And it turns out this persistent rise in mortality is at least partly driven by these very large earnings losses. So those individuals who have the largest earnings losses also experience the largest losses, the largest increases in mortality. Now, whether that's driven by an effect of resources or because large earnings losses trigger depressive symptoms, that is something we can't say. Now, before I pass this on to Jenny, let me just spend one slide talking about the effects of unemployment. So you may have noticed that so far I've only talked about the effect of job loss and not at all about the effect of unemployment or the duration of unemployment. And the reason is that it's very hard to actually measure the causal effect of unemployment and its duration. And but as you may have sort of gotten the flavor, it's already hard enough to measure the effect of job loss, but you have hope to get sort of a causal effect because you have some external variation at the firm level that sort of leads workers to lose their jobs through no fault of their own. Now, it turns out that even if workers become unemployed because of economic conditions, usually the decision to be unemployed or to stay unemployed is driven by individual workers' choices. So it's much harder to find a manipulation of unemployment or unemployment duration to estimate the effect of unemployment or unemployment duration. So a key message here is that one has to be very careful if one sees a claim that somebody has estimated the effect of unemployment or the effect of unemployment durations. Now, I think there are two sort of things we do know about unemployment duration. And one is in a very recent study, we show that in some circumstances, one can actually measure the effect of unemployment duration on earnings using variation from unemployment insurance extensions as a manipulation of unemployment duration. And if you do that, the effects of unemployment duration, perhaps not surprisingly, on wages are strongly negative. But the key point of the study that one has to be very careful, and in a typical sort of case, there are several different factors that affect the relationship between unemployment duration and earnings. And the second result that I think is reasonably well established is that unemployment and unemployment duration lowers self-reported happiness in the sense that unemployed workers are very unhappy, and that degree of unhappiness and a lack of self-worth are sort of increase of the spell of unemployment. So, you know, the short version is that unemployment duration does seem to have negative effects on earnings and well-being, but that finding is much less well established and much less broad than our knowledge of job loss. And with that, I'm turning this over to Jenny.
Thank you. Thank you, Till. Thank you, Mark. So, as just described by Till, there's this large body of research examining the effects of job displacement on subsequent levels of unemployment, earnings, job quality, and health. Less of this work examines the impact of displacement on social involvement or participation. So we know that job displacement can be economically, physically, psychologically damaging. The work I'm going to describe now asks whether and to what extent displacement is socially damaging. So some of the prior work on social participation evaluated the correlation between participation and employment status or earnings, sometimes between participation and disorderly career histories, but not so much the event of displacement, so much less work here. The study I'm going to describe now takes up this issue. This is the study by Brandon Burgard, published in 2008. So why should we expect a link between job displacement and social participation? First, employment and career stability, as I mentioned, have long been considered important factors in social participation. As far back as the 1930s, social theorist Emil Durkheim argued that employment performs an integrative role, drawing people into social life. Some other work in the 1960s by Walensky found that orderly careers were associated with strong attachment to one's community and society. Studies have also linked some of the potential outcomes of displacement, including unemployment, earnings, and job quality, to lower levels of social involvement. There's also been a link between psychological distress and social stigma and lower levels of social participation. And values and attitudes towards oneself and one's society may influence levels of involvement. So Robert Putnam argues that where there's positive social roles, social trust, norms of reciprocity flourish and individuals participate socially. So we can think in summary that displacement is associated with job instability, periods of unemployment, reemployment in jobs with lower earnings and or lower quality, psychological distress, potentially lower levels of self-acceptance, and potentially the erosion of commitment to social reciprocity and decreased social trust, which may all contribute to a lower level of social participation among displaced workers. Another natural question is why do we care about the effect of displacement on participation, or why should we study this link over and above thinking about the relationship between participation and disorderly careers or unemployment? First, to be characterized as disorderly, the career must entail substantial job movement. So those prior studies were generally thinking about a lot of movement in and out of jobs. It could be voluntary or involuntary movement. But there's a public concern and individual concern and family concern with the effects of involuntarily being displaced from one's job, even if that displacement occurs but once in the career, which makes the effects of job displacement on participation applicable to a large segment of the working population. Second, and Till was mentioning this point just a moment ago, there's an interesting and provocative set of results that emerged from studies of disorderly careers and from unemployment, but the causal links are more difficult. By contrast, studying displacement, we can, of course there's issues of selection in the study of displacement, but relative to studying disorderly careers or unemployment, it's more of an exogenous event. So it enables us to pay careful attention to the possibility of selection bias influencing the observed relationships between participation and or other kinds of socioeconomic status and these life outcomes. So the study I'll describe now is based on data from the Wisconsin longitudinal study, which is a panel study of over 10,000 Wisconsin 1957 Wisconsin high school graduates. The data that were collected from the mid-60s, the mid-70s, here where the cohort was in their mid-30s. Again, in the early 1990s, when respondents were about 52, 53 years old, and again in the mid-2000s, when they were in their early 60s. Across these years, the respondents were asked about their job separations, and we could get a good measure of job displacement and about involvement in various social groups, associations, and organizations. So we have repeated measures of these, of social participation. The data also capture a wide range of pre-displacement variables, including social origins, cognitive ability, educational attainment, labor market experiences, so that we're able to try and match displaced workers to non-displaced workers who have similar set of observed covariates. And the goal in the study was to examine the effects of job displacement on subsequent social participation, look at the effects across the life course, see if they persist over time, and then also to compare single versus multiple displacements to see whether it is a single displacement event has an impact on participation, or whether multiple displacement events or careers with more disorder to them characterize declines in social involvement. So here are some of the results from this study. So this is a table from this paper that now looks at the odds ratios of the effects of displacement on selected measures of social participation at age 53 in 1993 and 64 in 2004. This is for displacement occurring between ages 35 and 53. That was between 1975 and 1993. And then we also look at displacement that occurs in the later career between ages 53 and 64. We estimate a series of models, first bivariate estimation for differences in probabilities of social participation between displaced and non-displaced workers. And this test of differences just introduces the basic patterns in the data and provides a benchmark against which to evaluate changes that occur as a result of controlling for factors that influence the observed association. So we find that WS workers who are displaced between the ages of 35 and 53, this is in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, are significantly less likely than workers who are not displaced during this period to participate in church-related activities, charitable organizations, youth and community groups, professional groups, and social and leisure activities at age 53 and at age 64. This is all this first Model 1. We don't find a significant association with involvement in civic and neighborhood groups. By contrast, when we look at workers who are displaced in their later career, they're no less likely to participate in any of the forms of social involvement at age 65 relative to workers who are not displaced during this period. The next models, models 3 and 4, now report the odds ratios controlling for the set of observed covariates. And with the exception of involvement in professional groups, the lower probabilities of social involvement among workers displaced relative to their non-displaced counterparts are just slightly reduced and still statistically significant. Again, there is no significant decline in participation for workers displaced at later ages. The last set of models now control for pre-displacement social participation, and this is to provide some adjustment for unobserved heterogeneity that may influence the result strategy that Till described a few moments ago. So the estimates are reduced when we do this adjustment, but we continue to observe significant effects from church-related activities, charitable organizations, youth and community groups, and social and leisure activities for workers displaced in their prime earnings years, and no significant decline for workers displaced at later ages. So this may contrast somewhat to the effects on the economic consequences. The social consequences here seem to be greater among those workers who lose their jobs at younger ages. And another question we asked are single or multiple displacement events associated with lower probabilities of participation. So as I mentioned, most prior studies in this line of research have not examined displacement events per se, but careers marked by substantial job change. So this table 5 provides estimates of the effects of displacement for the single versus multiple, where multiple we're thinking is more job change, although the typical number of displacements is 2 in the multiple displacement category. And so we continue to control for the full set of predisplacement covariates here, including predisplacement social participation. We find that workers who experience one displacement between 1975 and 93 are significantly less likely to participate in a range of activities here. But and these magnitudes generally resemble those we saw in the prior slide where we looked at the whole group of workers. Those who experience multiple displacements are not significantly less likely to participate, except for church groups in 1993. And we continue to see no negative effects of displacement for workers displaced in later years. So as just a summary of this set of this study, so prior studies found significant economic and psychological consequences of displacement. Here we show some significant social consequences of displacement. It looks at early to mid-career job displacement is associated with significant and long-term lower probabilities of involvement in various modes of social participation. And this resembles also work that Till was describing of how long-term this impact is, that workers can be losing their jobs in their late 30s, early 40s, and we're seeing lower levels of involvement even in their 60s. Late career displacement, we didn't find any lower levels of social participation. We hypothesize that this is because job displacement may be less socially damaging for workers as they near retirement. They may be able to have a story for why they're displaced that isn't as socially damaging and doesn't involve as much social withdrawal as the workers who are displaced during their prime working years. These findings are important for both individual and societal reasons, given the potential importance of social capital to individuals' position in the labor market in the form of job networks. Lower likelihood of involvement may further impede displaced workers' ability to secure comparable reemployment. And as we'll discuss next, if displaced workers are parents, lack of social capital may have intergenerational consequences. More broadly, social participation is important to the effective functioning of our society, so this is a cost to society, not just individual workers. So next I'm going to talk about some work on parental job loss and children's outcomes. So we're demonstrating a lot of the effects of job displacement for workers, unemployment, wage declines, job quality, health, and now social participation. But how does this impact children when displaced workers are parents? So given this far-reaching impact of the displaced, we can reasonably expect that parental job loss should negatively impact children through a number of possible pathways. Socioeconomic decline can inhibit resources to purchase goods critical for child development and dampen children's own attitudes about the value of education and work. Psychological distress among parents may inhibit emotional warmth, increase parents' erratic or punitive parenting practices, could become communicable to the extent that children imitate the depressed behavior of their parents, and declines in social participation or parental social withdrawal, possible geographic mobility as well among parents may lead to declines in social capital for children. Despite these reasons to expect a link between displacement and child well-being, there have been fewer studies that have looked at parental job loss, although the number has been increasing in recent years since the recent Great Recession. A few of the studies have found deleterious effects of parental displacement on children's. A number of them look at kind of near-term outcomes, likelihood of grade repetition, dropout and suspension, expulsion from school, some kind of near-term self-esteem during childhood. Also some evidence for the longer-term consequences. At least one study looked at educational attainment, I think at age 21, and income in adulthood, and found negative effects of parental job loss on these outcomes. These studies that have been done largely focus on fathers' roles as financial heads of the family among married couple households and the consequences of losing such status. So they treat fathers as the essential component in the displacement equation and tend to find little impact of mother's job loss on children. They generally hypothesize that maternal displacement is not as detrimental to children's outcomes as paternal due to the greater psychological consequences associated with employment and income loss among fathers who are largely expected to maintain the role of primary provider. However, little work has looked at the consequences of job displacement among single mothers who then presumably would be the primary provider for their family unit. There is, of course, a large literature on socioeconomic attainment and psychological conditions of children who grow up with single mothers. Much of this work, though, treats single mothers' labor market experiences as a static state. or if the women are either employed or unemployed and each has its trials for raising children. Or there's some work on trajectories, but again, those tend to treat those trajectories as kind of voluntary states. So it's important to understand the impact of job separations due to structural economic conditions rather than as a result of voluntary choices, given, of course, that many employment transitions are involuntary. And also, again, the study of displacement provides this unique opportunity to assess how socioeconomic hardship among single mothers, less governed by issues of selection bias than some of the other measures that we might use to relate socioeconomic status among single mothers and children, how it affects the well-being of children. So in this study, we look at the effects of displacement among single mothers on children's subsequent educational and psychological outcomes in young adulthood. We're using data from the NLSY, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, follows a sample of over 6,000. We're looking at the young women of the NLSY, so there are over 6,000 young women who were 14 to 22 in 1979 and who were followed through 2010. And then we link that to the National Longitudinal Survey's child-mother file, which includes about 11,500 children of NLSY women who were followed from 1986 through 2010. Here we use a number of methods to try and look at children whose mothers were displaced to children who had mothers who were not displaced but were comparable in the set of characteristics that predict whether or not a child has a mother who is displaced. So we study average effects using a propensity score kernel matching, and this approach uses control units and weights them according to the distance and the estimated propensity scores of the target treated units. The propensity score is estimated by this regression of the set of characteristics that we use to predict maternal displacement. We report both treatment effects for the treated and treatment effects for the untreated, and these are given differential weight depending on the likelihood of treatment. So this will feed into discussion of variation in treatment effects, and here we look at the probability of maternal displacement, and that's governed by both the likelihood of displacement based on this propensity score estimation, but also whether the displacement occurred in recessions versus expansions, and then we look at local labor market areas and areas that have high versus what we call non-high unemployment areas, which will be 9% will be a high unemployment area. Then we also look at variation by the age at which the age of the child when the maternal displacement occurs, and use an approach for time-varying treatment effects that is described in, much of these approaches are described in a series of papers that I've written with Yushia at the University of Michigan. Okay, so the results, to begin studying the average effects, we estimate that propensity score model, and at first we're just looking at overall effects between ages 0 and 17. And I'll try and wrap up here. And so first we just look at the unmatched differences, then we can match children whose mothers had comparable propensities for maternal displacement, and we look at treatment effects for the treated and the untreated. This gives us some signal of whether children whose mothers had a high or low likelihood of displacement have larger or less effects. And we find effects on educational attainment, each measure of educational attainment, and on psychological well-being. Even after we match, we still continue to see significant associations. The effects are generally larger for the treatment effects on the untreated, which suggests that those children whose mothers had a low likelihood of displacement have larger effects of displacement than children whose mothers had a high likelihood. So this approach now just does the same kind of thing, and so I'm going to kind of skip over this because we're running short on time. So the same kind of finding across all these different, except for college completion, we find significant variation in effects such that there's a higher effect for the low propensity children. And that's true across all those outcomes. Same kind of thing we found for, the same kind of story we told when we looked across recession versus non-recession. And here, this is where I think some of the economic and social consequences seem some difference. We find greater effects in the non-recessionary period than in recessionary periods on children's outcomes. So women who lost their jobs during non-recessionary periods, and the same will be true when we look at local labor market areas, tend to have larger effects than those who are displaced in high unemployment areas. The approach to studying the time variation and so the effects across children's age when maternal displacement occurs. Here, just to give a brief overview, we find the largest effects when children are adolescents, and older children we find only one marginally significant effect for children whose mothers were displaced when they were young. So to give this brief summary now, so despite this large literature on looking at the effects of workers themselves, there's been less work that looks at children's outcomes, although again this work has been increasing. We find lower levels on educational attainment and depressive symptoms in young adulthood among children whose single mothers were displaced during childhood. And we find the largest effects for those mothers who have a low likelihood of displacement and when displacement occurs during adolescence. As to the variation in effects, one hypothesis is that socioeconomic shocks are more damaging to children in more disadvantaged families or those who experience the event in high unemployment contexts, as economic adversity is potentially more severe, it appears to be more severe. But our analysis of the effects of maternal displacement on children don't support this kind of view. It instead suggests that maternal displacement among children with this low likelihood yields the largest effects. The mothers who have a higher likelihood of displacement may have come to expect more instability in their lives, rendering the effect of displacement for their children less severe. They may be embedded in a social context in which displacement and economic distress is a more normative experience, less stigmatized as a result of individual failure. And I think I'll stop there so that Phil might want to summarize.
Well, I'm going to read the 2-second summary. So we gave you a bird's eye view on an increasing literature on the effects of job loss, and here then we zoomed in on a particular study, and I think the bottom line is that job losses have large and long-lasting consequences, not only on earnings and career outcomes, but also on health. They tend to reduce social participation, and perhaps most worrisome, they also have effects on children's long-term educational attainment. So I think that the results here confirm that job loss are truly distressing events for workers and their families.
Great. Well,
back to you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks very much to both of you. We do have a few minutes left for questions, so I'm going to pass along a couple of those to you. And the first one, I guess, is for both of you, and that's whether you had any opportunity to look at any of these effects of job loss or unemployment differences by race, ethnicity. Do the sample sizes of the surveys you're working with allow you to look at that at all?
Some of my work used the Wisconsin longitudinal study, so the limitation there is that this is primarily a sample of white individuals who are high school graduates and lived in Wisconsin. The work I did on the NLSY was just looking at children. Here we didn't stratify by race, although the strata we did based on the propensity score estimation were in large part, there were large differences by race across those strata. So the women who had higher likelihood of displacement tended to be Black and Hispanic more so than those who had a lower likelihood. So here actually the effects were not as severe for the Black and Hispanic women who were displaced, rather than the more advantaged white women who were displaced.
Okay. I've looked at differences across education and race in a study done in California. And so the general theme was that there seems to be a pattern by which those with very high skills have smaller losses than those in the middle of the skill distribution, who have larger losses than those at the bottom of the skill distribution. Meaning, in some sense, those in the middle distribution, skill distribution, have most to lose, whereas those at the bottom don't have much to lose, and at the top they can adjust better. And a similar pattern showed up to some degree for race. So far as non-whites tended to be in the middle of the skill distribution, they had larger losses, but if they were concentrated at the bottom of the skill distribution, the losses were not as long-lasting. But I'd say that the effects by race are an important sort of, question to study further.
I see. I think this is a question for Till. Do you know why earnings were lower after a job loss? Is it because people were not in the labor force, or because they were taking a job that was part-time, or is it because they were working full-time for lower wages, or is it some combination of all of those things?
So this is a very good question. There's sort of a two-part answer. Now, in the studies I've shown you, we look at annual earnings, so that combines effects on, say, part-time hours worked and possibly not working. But we know from this study and also from other studies that in the short run, the effect is driven by declines in employment, but most of the effect, sort of the 3 to 4 years out, is because workers take full-time jobs at lower pay. And then the question is, well, why are these workers taking jobs that are full-time but have lower pay? And so there's 3 channels why there are these large losses in wages effectively. And one is workers take jobs at firms that are paying less, so they take less attractive jobs to some degree. Second, they tend to take jobs at industries or occupations that are not their prior career or job, so they seem to lose somehow the access to the skills that they were using in their prior job. So that's the second channel. And the third channel is that many job losses occur in recessions, and what happens in recessions is that the wage at the new job goes down because wages in the labor market tend to decline, at least for new jobs. And then that lower reemployment wage tends to stick to workers for a long period of time. And these are the 3 channels where wages are lower.
Okay. This might actually be 2 questions. Are there opportunities to identify the biological mechanisms that produce poor health as a result of job loss? And why do young people experience long-term earnings losses that are almost as large as the relatively older workers who have less time to refocus their careers?
Those are both very tough questions. The first might be the tougher one. It's interesting. I think so. It's hard to identify the direct mechanisms. I mean, there's an increasing literature in other areas of social sciences that is gathering much more detailed data on actual biological mechanisms of the effect of, say, social environment or education on health. But there hasn't been a study of how job loss affects these biological mechanisms, because the data is usually not available for such large samples. Now, from sort of, if you take all the evidence on outcomes together, right, it seems to be both an effect to mental health as well as some degree of sort of, you know, factors affecting, say, heart attacks or strokes. So, you know, raising blood pressure would, for example, be one.
Health insurance.
Is another factor.
Yeah, and a lot of the surveys that have good measures of job displacement don't have the biomarkers that we would want to use to maybe make some of those links more clear.
But now for young workers, there is sort of another line of inquiry we didn't talk about today, is that describes how workers starting to work in a recession, so they did not lose their job because they didn't have one, but they entered the labor market in bad economic times. And these young workers experience quite substantial long-lasting effects. So there seems to be something particularly vulnerable about that early career period. So the question is a good question, because in some sense young workers may not have as much to lose and may be more flexible, but it turns out that that early career is particularly vulnerable, and we're not quite sure why, but one aspect seems to be that that is when one does form most of the network and skills that one then uses throughout the time in the labor market. And if that initial career, which is very important, is hurt by a job loss or by a recession, that can be very costly.
Okay. I think we just have time for one more question here. Is there any evidence that the effect on earnings in job loss was caused by macroeconomic forces such as greater global competition for labor that might be specific to the time periods that are being studied?
So that's a very good question. Now, first of all, we of course don't have a crystal ball, so we can look at past recessions, including soon this recession, but we cannot really predict very well into the future. Now, from what we know, there seems to be the effect of job loss seems to be quite similar over the last main recessions, at least since the early 1980s, and it tends to have a predicted relationship with the unemployment rate. Right? So definitely there is a macroeconomic component that's related to how the labor market is doing, and anything influencing how the labor market is doing matters. But we have not found direct evidence that, for example, increasing international competition due to trade or globalization or outsourcing has been sort of a particular driving force, because these losses don't just occur in, say, traded goods industries. They both the event of job displacement and the cost of job displacement occur throughout the board, throughout industries, occupation, education. And as we saw earlier, there is some variation, so there's a chance that some of these losses are explained by increasing international competition, and that might be then time and place dependent, but there seems to be more than that going on. There seems to be something relatively regular going on in the U.S. labor market, and every year there's a substantial amount of job loss, and then these job losses rise in recessions. And at least for the the last 30 years, these have been pretty predictable patterns. So I don't think the general message that job losses can be very costly is sort of purely related to particular things happening, say in the '82 recession or in the 2002 recession, for example.
Okay. Well, we're out of time, but I want to thank both Jenny and Till for taking the time today to present some of your research.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
And I want to remind everyone there will be a recording of this available for you to view or share with others. I want to thank everyone for attending, and I hope you'll participate in additional in future webinars that we're organizing under our NICHD Center. That concludes today's webinar. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.